municipalities have incorporated these codes into their laws, thus, in effect, delegating to code committees their own responsibility for protecting the public. Thank you, and I'm sorry for abusing my time.
No problem. Thank you, Deputy Chief Kelly. Mr. Dennis.
Hi, Hi, thank you, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to give Bob just a second to see if he can pull up the PowerPoint presentation. It's much of the presentation, as you are aware, is visual. Great. So, I'll wait for the first slide to show, but the emphasis of the presentation is what happens when industry voluntarily complies to a flawed standard, and I think this is exactly what's happening with ionization smoke alarms. I want you to meet my family. We were a family of 4. This is my firstborn, Andrea. Secondborn, Allie. These are my girls growing up together. There they are as young ladies. This is the date, April 13th, we lose Andrea. Happened to be 4 o'clock in the morning on a Palm Sunday. 2 years later, 4 o'clock in the morning on a Palm Sunday at Miami University, there was another fire. 3 more students died. The commonality between the 2 fires, 8 students died, more than 20 ionization smoke alarms were so-called protecting the house. However, they weren't really protecting the house. I didn't learn this 2 years later when I started researching smoke alarm technology. Now I'm going to fast forward. As you know, I submitted a lengthy PowerPoint, and I did so you had a lot of information. So I'm going to kind of go quickly to the gist of the presentation. That's the performance of ionization smoke alarms. They're flawed. Simply put, there's a standard by UL that allows them to pass the smoldering test, and that standard, that test has been around for over 40 years. And what they do is they smolder ponderosa pine sticks on a hot plate at 715 degrees, slowly crank up the temperature. The alarms are given 70 minutes to sound before a smoke obscuration level of 10%. They actually had to change the wood from Douglas to ponderosa pine because years ago they had trouble getting the ponderosa pine to pass the test. Now, this has been controversial for 40 years. Since the 80s, the California fire chiefs did their own testing and only trusted photoelectric smoke alarms. Texas A&M, University of Colorado for 2.5 years did testing. They didn't use hot plates roasting ponderosa pine sticks. They used actual furniture and cushions and started smoldering fires. You have all this before you, but I'm going to quickly show you a chart. Ionizations failed over nearly 60% of the time in smoldering tests, 60% of the time. These are in our homes. NIST has done testing on smoke alarms. Here's the 2 technologies. Very little difference in the flaming test. However, when you get into the smoldering test, suddenly you're seeing several tens of minutes of response time. This test NIST did, I want you to concentrate on the bottom, the smoldering test. 2-story house, smoldering fire, downstairs, could be in your furniture. Smoke alarms placed outside the common living areas, outside of the bedroom. ASCT means available safe egress time. So when the alarm goes off, how much time does the family have to get out of that house? With the photoelectric, 55 minutes. The ionization passes because it gave 16 seconds, and that was within a 3-minute escape time. However, if the living room air conditioning was running, the photoelectric time drops all the way down to 46 minutes. However, you get a negative 54 seconds with an ionization smoke alarm. That's the problem. It's the physics of the technology, and the people that work on these and understand them know that, but for decades nothing's been done. NIST issued a statement to the Boston City Council when they were looking at Massachusetts passing a statute statewide, and for 20 years the Boston Fire Department only would pass out photoelectric smoke alarms because they didn't trust ionization technology. The state of Massachusetts is the test case of how the difference between ionization and photoelectric technology. Their statement's very clear. Ionization technology has been shown to fail, and smoldering fires, even in a room, is filled with visibility. And they're 30 minutes sounding later on the average than photoelectric smoke alarms. Here's the NIST test. As you can see, this is from questions clarifying, NIST is clarifying the Underwriter Lab test that they used to prove the smoke alarms. It was developed in the late 70s to mimic the smoldering mattress and furniture. However, they're using ponderosa pine sticks. Furniture is made up of cushions and polyurethanes. How's that work in the real world? 2% of all fires account for 21% of all home fire deaths. To put that in perspective, annually, we have between 2,500 and 3,000 fire deaths. What number is 21% of that? You're getting 500 needless fire deaths a year. A lot of children are dying in their rooms. A lot of parents are dying. They have no idea these things are defective, and it's a flawed standard. There's a white paper report. It's Public-Private Council. You serve on that. Underwriter Laboratory serves on that. NFPA serves on that. They acknowledge that against the fires that have an extended smoldering period, there could be the ionization smoke alarms defeated anywhere from 3 to 25% of the total. What's the total? The total is our fire deaths. So now we're talking about anywhere between 90 and 600 or 700 people. Here's the smoke characterization project. UL decided not to smolder ponderosa pine sticks, but actually bring in cushions, polyurethanes, and test them in their labs. Guess what? 100% failure on the part of ionization smoke alarms in that test. What should be even more alarming to you is in 1 out of every 5 tests using the ponderosa pine sticks, the ionization alarms still failed. Yet, that is the singular test that they use in the large room to put their seal of approval on ionization smoke alarm. Public has no idea. They go to the stores. They want these for their kids' rooms. They buy them, and they're in the blind. After death, people are dying. Law firms on the bandwagon advertising, stating that the manufacturers know the ionization smoke alarm has a history of failure and defect. What's going on behind the scenes? Settlement after settlement after settlement is being settled out of court. But yet they're still not labeled. It's a little bit of irony that I'm here in Maryland because your largest city is Baltimore. And the gentleman next to me is from Massachusetts. His largest city is Boston. As I mentioned earlier, Boston has had a culture of photoelectric smoke alarm technology because they found the defects of ionization smoke alarm. Baltimore is in the dark because the statutes in Maryland, a smoke alarm is just a smoke alarm, and the most important thing is to make sure it's operational and there's a battery in it. How does this play out in the real world? Here's a period between 2009 and 2012. Baltimore had 75 residential fire deaths. You've already seen the number that Boston had that same time period, 4. That's the problem with ionization smoke alarms. Industry is complying to a voluntary standard, but that voluntary standard is deadly flawed. Warning labels need to be put on these things if you don't ban them and recall them, which I personally think you should do. They have no business in the marketplace. There's photoelectric smoke alarms for a couple dollars more. They have adequate protection across the full spectrum of fires. Ionizations are only effective in the flaming stages of fires if they're not disabled, and they do get disabled 5 times higher than photoelectric smoke alarms, once again, because of the physics of the technology. I know definitively that one of your top researchers here in the Consumer Product Safety Commission, Arthur Lee, has grave concerns, and I've seen letters shared that he's written to Underwriter Laboratories about their standards. I think it's time that these things get a solid review by the Consumer Product Safety Committee. You place them on your hazard list at minimum. I actually think you ought to recall them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. And Mr. Dennis, welcome back. And again, in the interest of time, if it's possible, please try to condense it as short as possible.
Yeah.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Certainly will, and once again, thank you very much. I want to dedicate this. I have a slide, hopefully it shows, to Avriana Dale, a New York little girl who we all think died needlessly because of the failure of ionization smoke alarms. I'm here representing the NEOFPA, as you mentioned, Northeastern Ohio Fire Prevention Association. It's 200 gentlemen that are fire officials that are dedicated to training and education for other fire officials, and they want to support scientifically based code standards. And they are very concerned that the data needed is not being, about ionization smoke alarms, is not being captured. They actually went out and had 2 buildings that were houses that were going to be torn down over the last couple of years period, ran their own data testing, set up smoldering tests, and their test actually replicated a lot of the information you found that I shared this morning. Significantly delayed response of ionization smoke alarms and not triggering. And the Euclid test done in January and February, there's over 20 minutes time difference. In the Mayfield Village test, surprisingly, in the 3 separate tests, and if you look aggregately, in only 1 test did an ionization alarm even trigger after an hour. Smoke conditions were so thick, people intoxic, the families would have died in there. So what NIST has given in their statement from the to the Boston City Council, that they've known not to fail, they've known to fail in smoldering fires and completely not sound at all, was validated by this group's testing. The reason that I'm bringing this up is not only are injuries and deaths not being captured in any of the data, but the significantly delayed performance of ionization alarms are not being captured to the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Another independent fire department, Barre, Vermont, upon the death of 4 children and a mother, happened to be relatives of the fire chief of Barre, Vermont. They all died. None of the ionization alarms, all hardwired, went off. When they went the day after the fire, tested them, they all worked. Now, in 2008, I think it's important to bring up a case. It's called Hackett versus First Alert. This case was appealed all the way to the Second Circuit Court, in the Court of Appeals, and the judge that resided over that ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and ruled that, quote, that the smoke detector's failure was a legal cause of deaths of William and Christine Hackett. The reason I'm bringing this up, at this meeting, there were 355 complaints filed. They had to be deposed. Is there a way for the CPS to obtain these real-world complaints? Do the manufacturers have to self-report? This is valuable information that is not being captured. We know from NFIR's reporting that more than 60% of people that purchased a smoke alarm yet died in a residential fire, that smoke alarm was working. It was found to be an effective working smoke alarm, but yet 62% of the people died. This is a statistic that's annually, it changes maybe by 1%, 2%, but the majority of people that die in house fires, their smoke detectors work if they had them. I mean, there are significant people that did not have them, but why are so many people dying with working smoke alarms? We certainly believe it's the technology, and that it's not being captured, the ionization technology. Lastly, one of the biggest problems is the NFIR's reporting system. Let me see, I have this slide. I think it's important to go over this one. If you look at this reporting, there's nothing that mentions the types of fire or the type of technology involved. As a matter of fact, when you get into L4, it talks about detector operation. If it operated, you go to block L5. If it failed to operate, which we would think an ionization, this is the problem, you go to L6. And the reasons that the person has to check is power failure, improper installation, defective, battery missing, discharged, or undetermined. So there is nothing there that captures anything about technology. So as I stated earlier this morning, we have anywhere between 400 to 1,000 people dying needlessly because of ionization detector failure, and we're not capturing it in our data system at any level. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dennis. And you focused on the one slide in the beginning that I got stuck on in your presentation, which was the Abriana Dale story and the fact that there was no fire damage, yet she still passed away from the smoke. And so that was certainly very eye-opening. Good morning. Welcome to this public meeting of the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission. We have one agenda item on today, or at least for this morning, and that is our priorities hearing for fiscal year 16 and 17. This is really for all of you, but Mr. Dennis, if you could jump in first, please. We can't do this alone, and hopefully you all are reaching out to your House and Senate representatives and senators and being heard. Is that the case?
I'm very hopeful. In Ohio, the fire community came together. The Fire Chiefs Association in Ohio wrote a letter and took a vote with their members. They are only supporting photoelectric smoke alarms. The Ohio officials only support photoelectric smoke alarms. So we have the whole fire community only supporting photoelectric smoke alarms. Problem in Ohio is the fire chief the fire marshal is housed under the Commerce Department. As we all know, if you can save a penny in a house, they're going to try to save a penny. So the only people fighting it is the Commerce Department. Recently, just last week, Senator Seitz, who I've been working with for 5 years on this topic, basically said, let's draft to make sure we have photoelectric smoke alarms per NFP code in every location is. And so I'm very hopeful that Ohio will follow Vermont and Massachusetts and a little bit Maine somewhat and pass a statute mandating photoelectric smoke alarms. So it is positive. The fire community in Ohio, the NEOFPA, Northeastern Ohio Fire Prevention Association, they even have a website up and are sponsoring a nonprofit to educate the public. But we need your help. We're Ohio. We can't cherry pick one city after one city after one city, just like the issue with window blinds issue. Whose child is next? It could be in California. It could be in New Hampshire. It could be in Florida. These smoke alarms, when you pick up a packaging, what was interesting, the first alert packaging, you flipped over the back of the ionization packaging, it said for best protection you need both technologies. Same model number on photoelectric, you turn the back of that packaging over, they didn't say you needed both technologies because 100% of all lawsuits and deaths are because of one technology, ionization technology. It's so simple, and to me, it's very justifiable for you under the newest act of the Consumer Product Safety Commission Act, was it 2010? I think you have granted extra powers where you can actually step in on this dangerous product.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Dennis, and thank you again to the panel. Unfortunately, my time has expired, so I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Adler in a second. But again, we very much appreciate you coming here. We probably will continue these dialogues with you, and I do hope that you also are reaching out to your U.S. House and Senators, and especially trying to reach them in your community, seeing them in their local offices. I think that'll make a huge difference.